Hey, everybody, welcome back to the JPU Show, the podcast show chock full of helpful and practical advice for podcasters of all skill levels. It's hosted by the Jax Podcasters United Group, the home for podcasters and audio creators in Northeast Florida. I'm your host, I'm Badr Milligan, and I'm joined by my co-host, the lovely Big Brain, Blythe Milligan. Hey, Blythe, how you doing today?
Hey, hello. Or
Hello?
hi, hello.
Hello. There you go.
Already forgot.
All right. Today, we are talking about podcast artwork. So I want to talk about some of our favorite podcast artwork. I want to talk about what makes for good podcast artwork and the importance of having, putting some thought into the artwork of your podcast. We just finished an episode about podcast episode titles and descriptions. And hopefully that came out before this episode. If not, well, guess what? We got that in the pipeline. But we just finished talking about how podcast episode titles and descriptions are just as important, right? It's among the many things that an existing listener as well as new listeners are able to look at and quickly judge. But I would also say your podcast artwork is also among the very first things that most listeners will look at. So you should put time and effort into how you create it. And I think this advice is maybe more so geared towards newbie podcasters that are just starting their podcast, that are looking to launch one soon. I think this is definitely an important checklist on that, or an important item on that checklist. And I'd also say maybe for the rare podcaster that's looking to rebrand or come up with some new artwork, maybe this is something that would be helpful for them too. So I guess, Blythe, let me take a step back. Your podcast artwork, you've actually gone on Fiverr. You've gotten professionals to work on your artwork, right? Have you ever created your own podcast artwork?
Yeah, the first one I ever used, and it was trash. And so that's when I started hiring people to do it for me. So
Okay.
The last, I would say probably 2 or 3 different podcasts, because so 3 different shows. I've had designers professionally design it for me. So it was Digital Dispatch at first, and then that changed into Everything is Logistics. I used the same designer for both of those to make that upgrade. Used the same designer for a third-party project that you and I had worked on together, the Maritime Means podcast. So that cover art, we had the same designer work on that as well. I think it's incredibly important from the jump to obviously have some good artwork, but I think we may disagree a little bit on some of what it should look like, I think.
I guess, what would you say makes for good artwork? Like when you're scrolling Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc., can you identify some common elements that maybe make you stop and pause? And I guess if you got any examples of your favorite artwork, feel free to share those too.
So the first thing I want people to kind of recognize is that familiarity. You need to have, in my opinion, I don't think you should be creating different podcast artwork for every episode. Not at all. I think you should actually keep it the same. I can go into more or I can, break it down a little bit later on. But from what catches my attention is very simple. 3 words or less, 2 is best. As simple of a graphic as possible, because for folks who are just listening, I'm sorry, but I'm going to scroll through my Overcast feed. And if I can hold this up to the camera, this is the real estate you're dealing with. Very small, right? And what do you notice about a lot of these shows? 2 or 3 words, very simple. There's shout out to Buzzsprout right there. So all of these shows, very simple. Another commonality between a lot of these shows is they have a photo of someone. So my thesis is that for a lot of creatives, we tend to get tired of our own content way faster than our audience does. And the reason for that is that your audience is inundated with things that are trying to get their attention. So you're not just competing with other podcasters, you're competing with the Kim Kardashians of the world for that audience attention. And so when all of these things are being thrown at you all of the time, all day, every day, no matter what social network you're on, no matter if you're in YouTube versus podcast, there is an art to creating a thumbnail or a way to grab someone's attention. And podcasting, I would argue that you need to keep the artwork, unlike YouTube, you need to keep the artwork the same. because as I just showed on my phone, you are dealing with such a small real estate, digital real estate on someone's phone, where 6 or 7 different pieces of artwork are in your face at any given time. If you're using an app like Overcast, if you're using an app like Apple, the podcast artwork is a little bit more prominent, way more prominent, I would argue. But you're competing with all of that different attention. And I think for a lot of creatives that we get tired of our own artwork so much faster than the audience does, and that you have a potential to harm your show if you change it up too many times, because you have to get the audience used to whatever that artwork is. That the name of your show is so small in that feed that the familiarity that you have hopefully developed is in the artwork itself, because people look at the artwork and then they look at the title. And if they don't recognize the artwork, then they look at the title for some kind of a hint on, is this something that I want to, entertain? Is this something that I potentially want to click play on? If not, then they're going to keep on scrolling. And so, in my opinion, the podcast artwork, it should absolutely be as simple as possible. It should be easy to read, whether it's large or whether it's small. And you need to keep in mind that your audience is inundated with things that are trying to take their attention. And so, especially starting out, first couple of years podcasting, I would argue that you need to keep your artwork largely this.
For sure. I think starting out, don't try to get too fancy with the episode artwork. The individual episode artwork is what we should say. Unless it directly correlates with that episode. Maybe you've got a guest on the show, or you're talking about a specific subject.
If
But
they're
I
a
think
big guest.
Yeah, I think starting out, you're trying to establish your brand. You're trying to get people familiar with your artwork, right? Your show artwork. And I think the best podcast and the best podcast with the best artwork, you're able to look at their artwork and tell, what is about the tone of it, the topic, your podcast artwork should be able to communicate a lot of different things at once. What's it about? What's the topic, the personality, the style, maybe even the genre? I think, if it's a personality driven show, if it's the topic is about you and your thoughts on things, then yeah, your picture should be the episode artwork. Maybe that should be the focus. If you have a hobby podcast, let's say like comic books, maybe some sort of imagery on that artwork that showcases exactly what it's about, comic books, or if it's murder mystery, something to that effect. Is it about a business or some sort of a field of business? Your artwork should reflect that. Like very common, what I feel like very common things to keep in mind is like your artwork should be able to tell a whole story on its own. And to your point, you're only dealing with, like you said, a very small real estate. I believe it's 150 pixels by 150. So a perfect square is what you're dealing with. So you're going to want to avoid small, intricate details, small text. You want to keep it simple. I think also like a striking color, a color palette that represents your show, but is also attention grabbing. I think is an important thing to also incorporate as well. I was going through just looking at some, various articles about what makes for good, podcast artwork and tips like that. And I came across this article by actually Buzzsprout. Shout out to Buzzsprout. And they go on to say in this particular article that podcast cover art is one of the most important pieces of your podcast brand, which is why we're talking about it. It's the first thing potential listeners see in Apple Podcasts and other directories. It signifies the quality of your podcast. I want to pause on that. It signifies the quality of your podcast. Like you were saying, if you go on Apple Podcasts right now, Spotify, whatever directory, you're inundated with at least 100 shows just on that homepage alone. And if your podcast artwork is looking janky or amateurish, and it could not be. It could be maybe the best content, a crispy audio, great guest interviews. But if your podcast artwork is looking amateurish, then that's what people got to go off of. It's the first thing they see, and people make snap judgments like that. So spending time, or at least giving your podcast artwork that level of importance and thought, I think is a very important step when first starting out. And even if you're not starting out, I'm definitely someone. Actually, I'll start sharing my screen right now, that has gone through quite a bunch of different iterations of my artwork. And I think a lot of that stems from just the subject matter being a visual. Hold on one second.
I think you also really love just art in general.
I am. So what I've got pulled up right now, I'm sharing my screen.
There's
And
so many versions.
Look, and this is what I'm talking about. We put ourselves on Front Street. All right. We're here to share practical and real advice for you, even if it's embarrassing to look back at. But I went ahead and compiled all of the different podcast artwork. And some of these, if I'm being real, you can't really even call podcast artwork because they're not even a square shape. But, you can kind of see the evolution of me kind of finding my way. But this was the first ever podcast graphic. And I believe we use this as the podcast artwork. I made this in probably Microsoft Paint. Looking at the quality of this, it's terrible, right? It's not in a square format. There's a lot going on. It's kind of muddy. I mean, it looks very amateurish. But I did this in 2012. I didn't know anything, and then it eventually, I think this was like version 2. So I just added like a white. Oh, this is so embarrassing to look at, but it's really funny. And then eventually we found like our look. And that particular gauntlet has been, as you'll see, a staple in the show. That is the logo, and it's gone through different iterations. But this, at some point, this is when I brought Edmund Danzar, a professional graphic design artist, to make the logo that we've been using ever since.
And let me help you out.
Oh, and thank God, right? And then eventually, this was a different one we tried. I wanted to go
really
for
like
something.
That one.
I still love this one. I wanted to go for something that put our faces. At the time, I was recording the podcast with 3 other co-hosts, and our personalities is what separated us from other podcasts. So I put that thought into the artwork. I think we did this around 2000. I think 17, 18, I let this ride for like a year or 2 as our artwork, and people loved it, right? And it also correlates and ties into the subject matter. We talk about comic books and pop culture. Well, we based this off of famous comic book corner boxes where they would have like a floating head in the background. And, that was the appeal. We wanted it to feel like a comic book with the old school stamp and headline. So, and all that, but this lets you know off the rip, okay, there's 4 people on this show. I think some of these are a little deep cut. I don't think this immediately screams like comic book, other than the art style, but it lets you know that it puts faces to the names, the voices you're about to get into. Then eventually the show, we started, life started happening. It became less of a conversational 4-person show, and I wanted to let the brand speak for itself, the logo. So now I'm starting to think, branding, merchandising, like, what is the central short box icon that I could use across the board? And once again, I think this was a combo between Ed and Ashley, who did the previous one I just showed, but I wanted something a little more simple, a little more sleek, that's got the name. I think this lasted for a year or 2. And then just last year, I worked with another professional designer to kind of give it a little facelift, still using the classic iconography of the gauntlet, the microphone that has been around a while. That's, that's kind of, familiar. Thank you so much. But something that stood out, something of a little more color, a little more simplistic, that could still be used in other platforms, other, just branding and other merchandising opportunities. Now, I want to share another tool as I was like looking up tips for good podcast art that kind of speaks to what you were saying about the real estate and thinking about like, okay, this artwork is going to be small. It's probably going to be viewed on a phone screen. There's a site called onlypod.com. They've got a few tools, some free, some not, but I think this is a free one where you can view your podcast cover art and you can preview it on what it would look like on different platforms. So you can either upload your artwork or search for it here, but let's just try the short box.
I think you got to switch to that tab.
Oh, okay. Share this tab. Got it. All right, there we go. So here's the site. You can either upload your cover artwork or you can just search for a podcast or your name. In this particular case, I went ahead and searched for mine. So you can get a preview of what this artwork would look like on Apple Podcasts. I think even... So the different pages. So this is like the search function. This is what it would look like in the library, in the listen now, all the different pages within Apple Podcasts. And as you can see here, this is what it would look like among other shows. So you want something that's attention grabbing, that's a little more striking, that would get someone's attention. And they also show you like what it looks like in Spotify, etc. I think this is a new tool to me, but I think for a beginning podcast or someone that's creating in the middle of maybe rebranding or creating artwork, this will put you in the mindset of what you're dealing with, the competition, how you need to go ahead and structure your artwork.
That's a good tool. It definitely helps to visualize what your artwork would look like next to someone else's, because I think especially when you're trying to give instructions to a designer, what examples are you sending them, but also just for your own mindset of understand. Sometimes, we just want to like vomit everything that we want to do. And a lot of times it just is like, to keep the same analogy, it's just a spit. Like you just want just a little bit. You want 2 or 3 words. You want simpler the better. So then that way someone can easily recognize and be familiar, recognize that familiarity, or see something that they might be interested in, to your earlier point of conveying what your show is about, who is the guest, and things like that. And I think that's where, a one solid, like really bright color, that's what really stood out to me as you were scrolling through all of those things, is that yellow on your artwork really stands out, especially if someone's on, dark screen mode. If you're scrolling through other, sort of, I guess, businessy style podcasts that are going to have a more, I guess, antique look to them, where yours, really pops and really stands out. So, what kind of podcast do you have? What are others in your niche doing? But then also looking outside of your niche and seeing where you can kind of stand out. Because if you're appealing to podcasters, you're probably appealing to folks who are used to playing podcasts. And I say that because, like, for me on Overcast, I have folders and I have systems for pretty much my whole life. But in podcasting, I have it too, where I have different shows, and if they fit a specific category, then they go in that category. And once a week, I'll go through all of my categories and all of the relevant shows. So I have, a sports tab where all of my sports shows are. I have, a logistics tab where all of my logistics shows are. You'd be surprised at how many of these shows, when you put them side by side, all look the same. All of their artwork looks the same. And so I think that just kind of goes back to, the point of like trying to not overthink it, but also be aware of what is out there currently in the market. I also think too, like, look at some of the bigger shows. How often do they change their podcast artwork? Not very often. They want to keep that familiarity. So while it's normal to have like a brand evolution, like, of course, like yours, where each of those changes, I would argue, is a necessity. But I think creatives also can tend to get tired of their content, of what they see a lot sooner than their audience will. And that may cause you to make some rash decisions where maybe you should be focusing your efforts on, just making better content instead of changing your podcast artwork because nobody's listening, or maybe your listens have dropped or something like that. Remember, nobody remembers your content like you remember your content. And so you have to keep that familiarity, especially as you get going. If you have major brand shifts, of course, do the update, but also communicate that to your audience in a variety of different formats, whether it's email, social, so they're not surprised. So they don't open up the podcast app one day and they don't even recognize that you've updated your artwork, because they're just skimming and they're just scrolling and they're trying to find something that, sparks their attention. You run the risk, and it's a fine line to walk, of relaunching a brand versus losing the familiarity that your audience may have with you.
Well said. And I want to recap just a couple of the tools and advice, and maybe one solid package here. We've talked about, in terms of how we've created our artwork, we both talked about, working with a professional designer. There's, a wide range of affordability when it comes to hiring, a professional graphic designer or artist or illustrator in this case, whether that be personal friends. I was able to leverage my 2 amazing artist co-hosts and, a co-worker that dabbles in this. You mentioned Fiverr. I think that's a great option too. There's plenty of price range artists that you can
I've moved on to 99 Designs. I know they've been around for a while, but I am just love the output of work or ideas that I've gotten from 99 Designs. So highly, highly recommend. And you could work with dozens, hundreds of designers to get a good look, versus like Fiverr, where you're working with one person.
Now, if you want to take artwork into your own hands, I think one tool that we both would recommend because we personally use it is Canva, whether that be the free version or I think I'm a converter and a truther now. I say pay the whatever 120 a year for the
Well, did
full
you see all the
package.
news, the ruckus that they caused, that they were going to increase all the prices, and then
I
the
did.
CEO, who I love, Canva is a female-owned company, female-founded company. She's one of the richest women in Australia. She might be the richest woman in Australia, but that's where
Oh wow.
Canva was founded. That's neither here nor there. But they changed their mind. So they listened to the outcry of the people who use their platform, and so they're keeping the prices the same if you are a Canva customer. But it's like $120 a year, and it's simplified so much of my design life. I think you can say the same with a lot of my favorite item is being able to have templates and being able to, for my episodes, for YouTube thumbnails, things like that, to have like 6 or 7 different templates. Use Canva. You can resize that graphic into, any kind of social media friendly graphic, whether it's a YouTube thumbnail or like a TikTok vertical thumbnail. Yes, love Canva.
Yeah. So Canva, great tool. We both recommend. I'll have a link to that podcast cover preview tool I shared, onlypod.com/podcast cover preview. There's another really awesome tool I didn't get a chance to share, but it's called Cooler, Cooler, and it'll generate a color palette for you. Like you hit the space bar and it'll show you different color palettes and you can kind of tweak, the certain colors you want. Which I think is always a good starting point, is thinking like, what color palette am I working with? Like, what fits my show? So there are a couple of the tools, and then I'm just do a rapid fire recap of the advice that we've talked about so far, just to kind of drill it into people's head. Make sure your art looks good at small scale. Leave out any minuscule, tiny text or detail that you can't look at on your phone. You want to aim for striking color, eligible legible text. You should be able to read. Your podcast name should be on the artwork. It should say exactly what I'm looking at. What else do I got? Use the Apple Podcast requirements, I think, as a basis and structure, right? So it's Apple Podcasts will tell you that your artwork needs to be 3,000 by 3,000 pixels, I think, or something to that effect. It needs to be in square shaped. I don't know them off the top of my head, but Apple Podcast has that written out. What your artwork should be spec wise. I think using that as a basis will go a long way, because more than likely every other directory is just going to use that as well. Think about the communication, the messaging that you want your artwork to communicate on your behalf to the listeners. Like, what the subject of your podcast should be very clear by the artwork. Use minimal words or clutter. Use high resolution images. I cannot tell you how many podcasts I've seen that use just not the best image resolution, like images that are low pixels or resolution, and they just don't look good when you, on the off chance that you are looking at a podcast in a bigger screen, maybe a computer screen, etc. Always use high resolution images. And then maybe keep in mind too, designing artwork that can be repurposed on other mediums. Like I had shared on mine, at some point I started thinking, what is the central icon for the show? And will that look good on a shirt? Will that look good on a website? Will that look good on a social media post or whatever it may be? Thinking larger than just the podcast, which, kind of sounds like a double negative compared to everything I just said. But, if you're thinking longevity wise and thinking like building a strong brand, you want to think about what your central icon or artwork would look like in maybe other mediums. And I guess most importantly, consider your audience, right? Like who is the ideal audience for you? And what are the imagery? What are the graphics, the things that speak to said audience? I think is a good way to wrap up this episode.
Yeah.
And
KISS method.
keep it simple, stupid.
Don't say y'all are stupid.
I don't know. The way you said it had a little bit of bite. But I think it's a perfect time as any to turn the tables on our listeners. If you have any tips when it comes to making striking, attention-grabbing podcast artwork, or if you got a story to share about how your podcast artwork came together, or some examples of your favorite ones, we would love to hear from you guys. Leave a comment in the YouTube video section or text us. That's right, text us some fan mail if you're listening to the podcast version. There's a link in the show notes. We've got other links to the things we shared in the show notes as well. Well, with that said, that is our episode today. Thank you so much for hanging out and tuning in. We appreciate you guys. Until next time, take care. Peace.